It was a crisp fall evening when the Thompson family arrived at their new home. Nestled in the heart of the countryside, the house stood like an old sentinel, its tall stone walls weathered by time and stories long forgotten. Emma Thompson, a sharp-witted woman in her early 30s, stepped out of the family van, taking in the view with a mix of excitement and unease. The house was grand, albeit a little eerie, and its sheer size seemed to swallow the surrounding landscape. It had been passed down from her late great-uncle, who had been a reclusive man with no living heirs, until now. "Are we sure about this?" Emma muttered to herself, rubbing her arms against the sudden chill that seemed to permeate the air, despite the mildness of the day. Her husband, Mark, put his arm around her shoulders, offering a reassuring smile. "It's a fresh start, Em. We've been looking for a place like this for years. Think about it. Big house, plenty of space for the kids." Emma glanced over at her two children, Sam, their curious and adventurous 10-year-old son, and Lily, their bright-eyed 7-year-old daughter, who was already hopping from one foot to the other, eager to explore the house. Both were ready to embark on their new life, but Emma couldn't shake the odd feeling that seemed to hang over the place. "Come on, let's get inside," Mark urged, seeing the hesitation in Emma's eyes. The door creaked open as they entered the house. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of dust and old wood. The grand foyer stretched out before them, the marble floors gleaming in the dim light. An ornate staircase spiraled upwards, its railing intricately carved with designs that seemed almost too perfect, too ancient. "Wow, this place is huge," Sam said, his eyes wide with awe. "Look at that portrait," Lily whispered, tugging at her mother's sleeve as she pointed toward the wall at the far end of the foyer. Emma followed her daughter's finger and froze. The portrait was large, an oil painting of a family, but unlike anything she had ever seen before. The people in the painting were dressed in old-fashioned clothes, their faces stern and unreadable. A man stood at the center, flanked by a woman and two children, their eyes dark and intense. It was a family portrait, but there was something unsettling about it. The way the figures seemed to stare into the room as if they were aware of the people who would later stand before it. Mark noticed his wife's unease. "It's probably just an old family heirloom. It's kind of cool in a creepy way," he said with a chuckle. But Emma couldn't shake the feeling that the eyes in the portrait were following her, their gaze shifting as she moved. She took a deep breath, shaking off the sensation. "I'll check the upstairs rooms," she said, trying to distract herself. "All right, we'll unpack downstairs," Mark replied, still looking at the painting. As Emma climbed the staircase, she heard the faint sound of creaking wood beneath her feet. She tried to ignore it, attributing it to the age of the house. The hallway at the top of the stairs stretched out before her, dark and narrow, with doors leading off in all directions. She was relieved to find that the upstairs was quiet and free from the overwhelming silence she had felt downstairs. She opened the door to the first bedroom, her footsteps echoing in the empty space. Downstairs, Mark, Sam, and Lily had begun unpacking boxes, settling into their new lives. It wasn't long before Sam came running up the stairs, his face flushed with excitement. "Mom, you've got to see this," he called as he reached the top. "What is it?" Emma asked, stepping into the hallway to meet him. Sam's eyes were wide. "That painting downstairs, it's changing. The people in it, their faces are different now." Emma frowned, thinking it must be a trick of the light. But as she hurried back downstairs with Sam, she stopped dead in her tracks. The painting, it was different. The faces, which had been cold and emotionless earlier, now seemed alive, their eyes fixed directly on Emma. She could feel their gaze as if they were no longer just figures in a frame, but real people watching her every move. The man in the center of the portrait was now smiling, a chilling, unnerving grin that stretched too wide, too unnaturally. The children's expressions had shifted as well, their faces now twisted in what could only be described as silent terror. Emma's heart pounded in her chest. She took a step back, a cold sweat forming on her skin. "Mom, what's wrong?" Sam asked, his voice trembling with confusion. I don't know," Emma whispered, her throat dry. "There's something wrong with that portrait." Mark joined them, his face relaxing as he noticed the change. "It's just an old painting, Em. Maybe there's a draft or something. It's nothing to worry about." But Emma wasn't convinced. There was something about that painting that sent a chill through her bones. Something deeper than just a simple shift in expression. She had to know more. Later that evening, as the family sat down for dinner in the grand dining room, Emma couldn't stop glancing at the painting. The room felt colder now, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally across the walls. The eerie silence of the house made her feel isolated, as if they were the only ones left in the world. Lily, her voice small and uncertain, broke the silence. "Mom, I don't like the people in the painting. They're looking at me." Emma glanced at her daughter, her heart racing. "It's okay, sweetie. They're just old pictures. They can't hurt you." But deep down, Emma wasn't sure. The air felt heavy, thick with something unspoken, something malevolent that had been waiting for them. She couldn't shake the feeling that the portrait was watching them, waiting for something. That night, as Emma lay in bed, her mind raced with questions. Why had the portrait changed? Why did it feel like something was alive in the house with them? She tossed and turned, unable to sleep, her eyes darting toward the door every few moments as if expecting something, or someone, to emerge from the shadows. The next morning, Emma made up her mind. She had to get to the bottom of this. She would search the house for answers. As she made her way to the library, the house seemed even quieter, the silence now almost suffocating. There, among dusty old books, she found an old family journal, its leather cover cracked and worn. Flipping through its pages, Emma uncovered disturbing details about the portrait. The painting had been in her family for generations, passed down from one relative to the next. But each time a new family member inherited it, something strange happened. The faces in the painting would change, growing more grotesque, more disturbing with each passing year. Emma's blood ran cold as she read the final entry. The portrait never stops changing. It reflects the truth of the bloodline it belongs to. The curse will never be lifted. Beware the year the faces change again. Emma's heart skipped a beat. She turned to the window, her eyes scanning the darkening horizon. She had a sinking feeling that the next change was coming. And this time, it might not just be the portrait that changed. Suddenly, she heard a faint whisper. It seemed to come from behind her, soft and urgent. "It's time." The next few days felt like a haze to Emma. She couldn't escape the constant feeling that she was being watched, not just by the eyes in the portrait, but by the house itself. The air had grown heavier, colder, and every creak of the floorboards seemed to echo through her mind like a warning. Mark had grown more dismissive of her fears, brushing off her concerns with the same easygoing attitude he always had. But Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The whisper in the library still haunted her. It was a soft voice, barely a sound, but it had been so clear, so urgent. "It's time." What did that mean? Time for what? It was the afternoon when the second change occurred. Emma had been upstairs, searching through old family records, trying to uncover more about the portrait and the curse that seemed to bind her family to it. The room was dim, the only light coming from a dusty window that offered a view of the surrounding woods, their dark, twisted branches moving eerily in the wind. As she turned the page of an old leather-bound book, Her eyes landed on an entry that made her blood run cold. The portrait is not just a family heirloom, but a conduit, a doorway. The faces in it are not simply portraits. They are souls bound to the bloodline, waiting for the time to be set free. The curse cannot be broken. It must be embraced. The words seem to glow in the dim light, their meaning sinking into her bones like ice. She quickly closed the book, her hands trembling. Something was wrong, so terribly wrong. She had to find Mark, show him what she had uncovered. When Emma descended the stairs, her heart nearly stopped. The portrait had changed again. But this time, it wasn't just the faces that were different. The figures in the painting were no longer standing stiffly in place. They had begun to move just slightly, as though they were alive. The man in the center of the painting had taken a step forward, his dark eyes gleaming with an unsettling intensity. His smile had become wider, more sinister, while the children's eyes had turned black, as if they were staring directly at Emma, pleading for help, or perhaps warning her. Lily stood frozen by the portrait, her eyes wide with fear. "Mom, it's happening again," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Emma rushed to her daughter's side, her breath quickening. She could feel the heat of the room intensifying, as if the air was thick with an unseen presence. "Mark!" Emma shouted, her voice rising in panic. "Mark, come here now." Mark hurried down the stairs, his expression a mixture of irritation and concern. "What's going on, Em? Why are you—" He stopped mid-sentence as he saw the portrait. His face turned pale, his eyes widening in disbelief. "What the hell?" Moving. The family stood there in stunned silence, staring at the portrait as the figures shifted, their movements growing more pronounced. The man in the center of the painting stepped forward again, his foot lifting slightly off the canvas as if he were about to step out into the room. "This isn't possible," Mark muttered, stepping closer to the painting. "There has to be some explanation. Maybe it's some sort of trick, some hidden mechanism behind the frame." But Emma knew better. She could feel it. The presence in the room, the heavy, oppressive air that made her skin crawl. There was no trickery here. The portrait was alive. It was part of something far darker than they could understand. Suddenly, the room grew cold. A gust of wind swept through the house, even though the windows were tightly shut. The lights flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and writhe like living creatures. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as the sound of distant whispers began to fill the air. They were soft at first, just barely audible, but soon they grew louder, more frantic. The whispers were coming from the painting. "Let us out. Help us. Join us." The words were chilling, distorted, as if they were spoken by something far beyond human comprehension. The faces in the portrait were contorted now, the man's smile twisted into a grotesque grin, while the children's eyes burned with an unnatural glow. They were no longer just a reflection of the family's past. They were something darker, something that had been waiting. "Mom, I'm scared," Lily whimpered, her small body trembling beside Emma. Emma's mind raced. What had she uncovered? What had she awakened? She looked around, desperate for answers. There had to be something she could do to stop this, something to break the curse before it consumed them all. But as she turned to leave the room, she was struck by a sudden, overwhelming feeling of dizziness. Her vision blurred, and the walls seemed to shift, closing in on her. The room spun as if the ground beneath her feet had turned to liquid. Mark caught her before she could fall, his arms steadying her as her head swam with strange, fragmented images. "Emma, are you okay?" he asked urgently, but his voice sounded distant, muffled, as if she were hearing him from underwater. I don't know," she gasped, struggling to stay conscious. The painting, It's alive." Mark helped her to a chair, his face filled with concern. But as Emma's head cleared, she noticed something even more disturbing. The portrait had changed again. This time, it wasn't just the faces of the family that had shifted. The background had darkened, and strange, shadowy figures began to emerge from the corners of the frame. Their outlines were blurry, indistinct, but Emma could see them, dozens of them, reaching out from the depths of the painting as if trying to claw their way out. "Mark, we need to leave," Emma said, her voice trembling with panic. "We have to get out of here. This house, it's cursed." But as she turned to leave, she noticed something that froze her blood. The door to the hallway was no longer where it had been. The house had changed. The hallway that had once led to the exit was now a dark, twisted path, with the walls closing in on her. The whispers grew louder. "Leave. Leave now." Emma felt a hand grip her arm, pulling her back toward the portrait. She turned to see Lily, her eyes wide with fear. "Mom, we can't leave," Lily whispered. "They're waiting for us." The room darkened further, the shadows stretching unnaturally, as the whispers grew to a deafening crescendo. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as she realized the truth. Whatever was trapped inside the portrait was no longer just a memory. It was coming for them, and there was no way out. The silence was deafening. When Emma awoke, she was no longer in the sitting room. The familiar scent of old wood and musty air was gone, replaced by a cold, damp chill that nipped at her skin. Her limbs felt heavy, as though she had been asleep for a long time, though her mind screamed that it couldn't have been more than a few moments since she had last seen Mark and Lily. Her eyes fluttered open, and the first thing she noticed was the darkness that surrounded her. She was in a small, windowless room, the walls damp and covered in creeping moss. There was a low, flickering light from somewhere, casting eerie shadows that seemed to stretch and bend unnaturally. She tried to move, but her body felt stiff, sluggish. Panic began to rise in her chest as she pushed herself up from the ground, only to stagger slightly, her knees wobbling. Her breath came in ragged gasps, and she could hear the faintest echo of distant whispers. "Lily? Mark?" she called out, her voice sounding strange in the silence, almost as if it had been swallowed by the dark room. There was no reply. The room she was in felt suffocating, the air thick and heavy with an almost tangible presence. The walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own, and as Emma took a step forward, she felt an unsettling sensation like invisible eyes were watching her every move. She pressed a hand to her forehead, trying to shake the fog from her mind, but the dizziness returned, stronger than before. She needed to find her family, needed to get out of this place before it consumed her. As Emma stumbled forward, she noticed something strange. A painting on the far wall. It was a family portrait. It looked eerily similar to the one back at the house, but this one was different. The figures were darker, their faces twisted in pain and suffering. The man in the middle, the same one from the original portrait, was now draped in shadows, his face a horrific blend of agony and rage. The eyes of the children were wide and unblinking, their mouths open in silent screams. But what made Emma's blood run cold was that the portrait was alive. The figures in the painting were no longer static. They shifted, moved, their bodies twisting and writhing, as though trapped within the frame, desperate to escape. She could see their eyes flicker, their hands reaching out from the canvas as if begging for release. "Mom!" Emma turned, her heart leaping in her chest. Lily stood in the doorway, her eyes wide with fear. Her face was pale, and her body trembled as if she had been through something unspeakable. "Lily!" Emma rushed to her, pulling her into a tight embrace. "Where's Mark? What happened? Where are we?" Lily's voice was barely a whisper, her words trembling. "I don't know, Mom. I don't know how we got here." Emma's heart sank. She had no answers, no understanding of what had happened after the portrait had reached out for them. The darkness, the shadows, the cold. It was all too much. She had to find a way out, a way to break the curse before it consumed them all. But as Emma glanced back at the painting, a horrific realization settled over her. The portrait was no longer just a reflection of her family's past. It was an active force, something malevolent that was feeding off their fear. And now that they were here in this twisted, dark place, it seemed to be getting stronger. "We need to get out," Emma said, her voice firm, though fear gnawed at her insides. "We need to find Mark." Lily nodded, her eyes darting nervously around the room. She seemed to shrink into herself, as if she could feel the same suffocating presence that Emma did. "Where do we go?" Lily asked, her voice trembling. "Everything is so dark." Emma took a deep breath, her mind racing for a plan. But before she could answer, she heard something. Faint at first, but growing louder. The sound of footsteps. "Mark!" she shouted, relief flooding through her chest. "Mark, is that you?" The footsteps grew louder, more hurried, as if someone or something was moving swiftly toward them. But as the figure emerged from the darkness, Emma's breath caught in her throat. It wasn't Mark. The figure was tall, its face obscured by a shadowy hood. It moved with an eerie, unnatural grace, and as it drew closer, Emma's skin crawled. Its eyes, glowing faintly with an unnatural light, fixed on Emma and Lily with an unsettling intensity. Who are you?" Emma demanded, trying to steady her breath, her body tensing in fear. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it raised a hand, its long fingers curling into a claw-like shape. The air around it seemed to thicken, and Emma felt an oppressive weight pressing down on her chest. Lily whimpered beside her, clutching Emma's arm tightly. "We need to go, Mom," Lily whispered. "Now?" Emma wanted to run, but her body refused to obey. She could feel the figure's presence wrapping around her, suffocating her, as though it were feeding off her fear. And the longer she stood there, the harder it became to breathe. Suddenly, the figure spoke, its voice like a low, guttural growl. "You shouldn't have come." The words were chilling, and as they echoed through the room, Emma's mind raced. The figure was no longer just a shadow. It was something much darker, a manifestation of the curse that had followed them here. It had been waiting for them. The air grew colder, the shadows closing in around them. Emma felt her strength draining away, as though the figure was leeching the very life from her. She glanced at Lily, whose face had gone ashen with terror. "Run," the figure hissed, its voice now a twisted rasp. "But you can't escape." Without thinking, Emma grabbed Lily's hand, pulling her toward the door. But before they could reach it, the room seemed to shift, twisting, warping, and then everything went black. Emma's breath quickened as she scanned the hallway. The portraits were everywhere, their faces twisted in silent agony. They seemed to move slightly as she walked past them, their eyes following her every step, watching her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. The eerie glow from the paintings cast unsettling shadows on the walls, and the very air around her felt thick with dread. She pulled Lily closer to her, her grip tightening as she tried to make sense of what was happening. The figure from the room, the one that had spoken to them, was in every portrait, lurking in the background, watching with its glowing eyes. "What is this place?" Emma whispered, her voice trembling. "Where are we?" Lily's face was pale, her body shaking as she clung to Emma's side. "I don't know, Mom. I don't know how we got here." Emma's mind raced, trying to piece together what little they knew. The portrait back at the house, this cursed family heirloom, was at the center of it all. The painting had changed, shifted, every year, revealing secrets of their family's dark past. But this was something else entirely. They were trapped in a nightmare, and there seemed to be no way out. Suddenly, Emma heard it again. The soft, steady footsteps. This time they were closer, much closer. "Mark," she called out, her voice barely above a whisper. Her heart raced in her chest, the hope that her husband was still alive, still somewhere in this terrifying place, flickering weakly within her. But the footsteps didn't stop. A shadow appeared at the end of the hallway, a tall, dark silhouette that slowly moved toward them. Emma's heart skipped a beat as the figure emerged from the darkness. It wasn't Mark. The figure was tall, almost unnaturally so, and its face was still obscured by the shadowy hood. The same eerie, glowing eyes locked onto Emma, sending a chill down her spine. It was the same figure they had seen before, the one that had spoken to them, the one that had warned them. It stepped forward with slow, deliberate movements, its shadow stretching unnaturally long, as if it were feeding off the very light in the hallway. "You shouldn't be here," the figure said, its voice cold and low, sending shivers through Emma's body. "You should have stayed away." Emma's knees wobbled, and she had to hold on to Lily to keep from falling. Her mind was racing, and she knew they needed to escape. But how? "You cannot escape," the figure continued, its voice growing darker, more menacing. "You belong here, just like the rest of them." Emma tried to back away, pulling Lily along with her, but the hallway seemed to stretch endlessly before them. The walls closed in, the portraits now growing darker, more grotesque with every passing second. The eyes of the figures in the paintings seemed to burn into her, like 1,000 accusing stares. The figure was right behind them, its footsteps heavy, echoing through the hallway like the ticking of a death knell. "Mom, we have to do something," Lily cried, her voice filled with panic. Emma's thoughts scrambled, trying to think of a way out, but the figure's presence was suffocating, its very existence pressing in on her from all sides. There was no escape, not from the hallway, not from the portraits, and certainly not from the figure that had cornered them. "You will not leave," it whispered, its voice now low and guttural, like the sound of something ancient and malicious waking from a long slumber. "Not while the curse still lives." And then, as if on cue, the portraits began to change. Emma gasped, her blood running cold as the faces in the paintings shifted. The eyes that had once seemed cold and distant were now wide with terror, their mouths open in silent screams. The once still bodies twisted and contorted, as if trying to break free from the frames that held them. And at the center of each portrait stood the figure, the one they had seen before, its presence dominating every image. But then, in the farthest painting, something new emerged. A figure, not entirely human, stood in the background, its silhouette barely visible in the shadows. It was tall, its limbs unnaturally long, and its eyes cold, lifeless, glowed with the same eerie light that the figure had. But this figure was different. It was watching them. "No," Emma whispered, her heart hammering in her chest. This isn't possible." The figure in the painting raised its hand, and in that instant, Emma felt a searing pain in her chest, like something was pulling at her very soul. She gasped for air, her vision blurring as she stumbled back, clutching her chest. Lily screamed, but Emma couldn't hear her. The pain was unbearable, a twisting, gnawing sensation that felt like it was tearing her apart from the inside out. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the pain stopped. Emma collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath, her body trembling. She could feel the figure's presence pressing in on her, like it was watching, waiting. The portraits remained frozen, their faces locked in silent terror. But Emma could sense that something was changing. The curse was growing stronger. "You have no choice but to stay," the figure whispered again, its voice now an omnipresent force in the room. "The curse will consume you, just as it has consumed all the others." Emma struggled to her feet, her mind reeling. She looked down the hallway, the endless rows of portraits now a blur, and her eyes landed on the farthest end. There, in the distance, a door. It was their only hope. "Lily, we have to go now," Emma gasped, pulling her daughter along. The figure loomed behind them, but they had no choice. The door at the end of the hallway was the only way forward. But as they ran toward the door, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that the figure, its curse, was already inside her, inside them both. They were trapped, and the only way out might be worse than staying. The air was thick with an oppressive stillness, suffocating and unnatural. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as she lay on the cold, stone floor, struggling to breathe. Her ankle burned where the shadowy tendrils had gripped her, pulling her backward into the darkness. Lily's terrified scream echoed in her ears, but the sound seemed distant, as if it were coming from a place far beyond her reach. "Lily!" Emma gasped, her voice weak and trembling. She tried to push herself up, but the shadows tightened around her, dragging her deeper into the cold abyss that seemed to consume everything in its path. "No," she whispered, the words choked by fear. "Not now." She could feel the presence of the figure closing in on her, its chilling gaze penetrating her very soul. Every breath she took felt like a struggle, as if the air was thickening with the weight of the curse that had been unleashed upon them. The portraits on the walls, once merely eerie, now seemed to be alive, their faces twisted in agony, their eyes locked onto her with a predatory hunger. But there was something else, something far worse. "You cannot escape," the figure's voice echoed through the darkness, reverberating in Emma's mind, causing a sickening shiver to run down her spine. "You are already ours. You always have been." Emma gasped for air, her mind struggling to grasp the full weight of the figure's words. She had no time to think, no time to make sense of it all. She had to save Lily. She had to. "Mom!" Lily's voice broke through the haze of terror, and Emma's heart twisted. She looked up, and for a moment, she saw her daughter's frightened face in the dim light. But it was only for a moment. In an instant, Lily's face disappeared, swallowed by the same dark shadows that surrounded Emma. "Lily!" Emma screamed, her voice cracking with desperation. But there was no answer. Instead, the shadows seemed to coil tighter around her, squeezing the life from her body. She tried to scream, to fight back, but the darkness was relentless, its cold fingers tightening around her, suffocating her. "Please," Emma whispered, her breath shallow, her vision blurring. "Please don't take her." But the darkness didn't care. It pulled her deeper into the shadows, dragging her away from the only light that had ever given her hope. The portraits on the walls, the eyes of her ancestors, seemed to mock her, their expressions cruel and unforgiving. "You are part of us now," the figure's voice echoed again, this time from all around her. "You cannot escape the blood that runs in your veins." And then the shadows shifted. For the briefest moment, Emma could have sworn she saw something. Someone, standing in the distance, a figure, moving slowly, deliberately, like a ghostly silhouette emerging from the depths of the dark. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its face was something she could never unsee. It was her face, but not quite. The figure stepped forward, its movements almost inhuman, its eyes glowing with the same sinister light that filled the room. And then it spoke. "You are not alone," it whispered, its voice a low, guttural sound that made Emma's blood run cold. You are one of us. The shadows around Emma seemed to pulse with life, their tendrils pulling tighter, suffocating her. But as the figure drew closer, something in her mind snapped. A fleeting memory, a glimpse of something long buried, flickered in her mind. A memory of a time before this cursed house, before the painting, before the dark forces that had claimed her family. The figure loomed closer, its dark eyes fixed on her with cold, unyielding hunger. It reached out a skeletal hand, its fingers long and twisted, and for the briefest second, Emma saw the truth. The painting, the family, her bloodline, she was the final piece. You are the last, the figure rasped, its voice now an unsettling whisper in her ear. The curse will be complete once you accept your place among us. Emma fought to breathe, to resist, but she could feel the weight of the curse pressing down on her, growing heavier with each passing second. The air grew colder, the darkness thicker, until all that remained was the echo of the figure's voice in her mind. No, she whispered, but the words felt foreign, weak. The darkness was closing in, and Emma felt herself slipping away. And then, just as her vision began to fade, something broke through the suffocating grip of the shadows. A voice, familiar, warm, cut through the coldness like a beacon of hope. Emma, hold on, Mark's voice shouted from somewhere beyond the darkness. I'm coming for you. Emma's heart skipped a beat. Mark, he was alive. He had found them. But even as hope bloomed in her chest, she realized it was too late. The shadows were too strong, the figure too powerful. She couldn't fight it. Not alone. The figure reached out, its cold hand closing around her wrist, pulling her toward the endless void. Emma tried to scream, to call out to Mark, but her voice was silenced by the overwhelming darkness that had consumed her. The last thing she saw before the shadows swallowed her whole was the face of the figure, a twisted version of her own, with hollow eyes that seemed to burn into her soul. And then, there was nothing. Mark's voice reverberated in the dark, distant and helpless. His frantic calls seemed to fade into nothingness, swallowed by the all-encompassing blackness that surrounded Emma. The once familiar house, now a maze of shadows and cold stone, felt like a distant memory, as though the darkness had claimed not just the house but everything inside it. The cold hands that gripped Emma's wrist tightened, pulling her deeper into the darkness. She struggled to breathe, her lungs constricting as if every breath she took made the void grow tighter. Her vision blurred, the edges of her sight fraying like the final threads of a broken tapestry. Mark, she whispered, her voice weak, fading. But it was futile. The darkness seemed to mute everything. Her cries, her thoughts, her very existence. She was alone. And then, the cold voice of the figure spoke again, sending a shiver of dread down her spine. It is done, the figure rasped, its voice echoing like the whisper of 1,000 souls. The curse has claimed you, as it claimed your ancestors. You are now one with us. Forever. The words cut through Emma like a blade. The curse? Her ancestors? Her mind swirled with confusion. But then the memories came. Fragments of a past she had tried so desperately to forget. Faces, names, and places that had been locked away in the darkest corners of her mind. Her family's history, their bloodline, the house, the portraits, the curse that ran through their veins. Her heart pounded as realization hit her like a thunderclap. She had thought it was all just stories, myths passed down through generations. But this was real. The portrait, the family, the ever-changing faces. They had all been leading to this moment. She was not just a victim of some ancient curse. She was the final piece. The figure's hand, long, skeletal, and cold, moved to her throat, and Emma gasped. The air left her lungs, her world spinning as she felt her life slipping away. She couldn't think, couldn't focus. But then, the figure's voice, once again, penetrated the haze. "You have no choice," it said, its voice soft and commanding. "The portrait is alive. The curse has taken form, and it will not rest until you take your rightful place." "No!" Emma gasped, her mind fighting against the dark pull that threatened to overtake her. The portraits, their faces. She realized now that they were not just images. They were alive. They had been waiting, watching, all of them. Every ancestor, every relative whose face hung on the walls of that cursed house. They were part of this. They were all a part of the curse. And she was the last. "But I'm not." She tried to protest, but her voice was choked off by the grip on her throat. "You are." The figure's hand lifted her off the ground effortlessly. "You always were. The blood that runs through you is ancient. You are the final heir, the last piece of the family portrait. Accept it." In that moment, Emma understood. The portrait wasn't just a picture. It was a vessel, a gateway for the curse, a record of every soul that had ever been part of the family's bloodline. Every generation, every face had been trapped within it, evolving, changing, waiting for the final one to complete the cycle. And she was that final one. With trembling hands, Emma reached up to the portrait behind the figure. It was closer now, and its eyes seemed to follow her, its expression darkening as the curse grew stronger. The faces, her ancestors, twisted in agony as the darkness enveloped them. She saw their torment, their suffering, their desire to escape. And now it was her turn. Her bloodline had been born to suffer, to be part of the cursed legacy. And it was her time. "No," she whispered again. But this time, there was no strength in her voice. She felt the weight of generations bearing down on her, the weight of 1,000 lost souls, pulling her toward the portrait. Suddenly, the grip on her throat loosened. For a brief, fleeting moment, Emma felt a glimmer of hope. But as she gasped for breath, she realized it was not mercy that had released her. The figure was simply preparing her for what was to come. The darkness around her seemed to grow colder, more suffocating. The walls seemed to close in, the weight of the curse pushing down on her with an unbearable force. "You cannot escape your fate," the figure whispered, its voice now a low, chilling growl. "You will join us, whether you wish it or not." Emma's heart raced. She could hear Mark's voice again, distant and faint, calling her name. But the figure's grip on her tightened once more, dragging her closer to the portrait. She reached out desperately, but her hand passed through the cold, empty air. And then, in the depths of the shadow, she saw it, the eyes. Eyes that were not her own, yet reflected her very soul. They were in the portrait, watching, waiting. Her fate was sealed. The figure stepped back, and for the briefest moment, Emma was free. She gasped for air, her chest heaving as her mind tried to process what was happening. And then she heard the sound, a soft scratching noise. At first, it was barely audible, like the sound of a distant whisper. But then it grew louder, closer, until it felt like something was crawling beneath the skin of the walls. Something was coming. Emma turned, her heart pounding, but there was nothing. Nothing but the portrait. Its face now twisted, grotesque, as though the image itself was writhing in agony. Then the scratching stopped. There was a moment of eerie silence. And then the portrait shifted. The faces in the painting, once serene and composed, now looked in horror as their eyes seemed to lock onto Emma. And then the eyes in the painting began to move. "No," Emma whispered, stepping back. "No." The eyes shifted toward her, their gaze now predatory, hungry. And then, something far worse happened. The portrait began to warp, twisting, stretching, distorting as the figures inside reached out. "It's time," the figure behind her growled. Emma's world had gone completely dark. There were no sounds, no sensations, nothing but the deep, suffocating silence of the cursed family portrait's grip. The portrait's twisted faces, their eyes, haunted her thoughts, but now there was only the void. In that crushing emptiness, she could no longer tell if she was awake or trapped in the clutches of a nightmare. Time seemed irrelevant here, as if the very nature of reality had begun to bend. She had no idea how long it had been since she last saw the portrait, the cursed thing that had always been a part of her family's bloodline. The faces from the painting, twisted and malevolent, seemed to have merged with the darkness that surrounded her. Every corner of the black void seemed to close in on her until she was suffocated by it. But then, just as she thought she might lose herself entirely, a flicker of light broke through the suffocating darkness. It was faint, a small crack in the vast emptiness. But Emma's instinct, driven by panic and fear, made her focus on that light. The brightness grew, illuminating the scene around her. Gradually, she began to see her surroundings again. The walls of the house, the familiar, oppressive atmosphere, but something was wrong. The walls themselves seemed to be breathing, as though they were alive, pulsing in sync with her heartbeat. "Emma," a soft voice whispered through the air. It was Mark's voice, faint, distant, and broken. "Mark," Emma tried to call, but her voice was barely a whisper. She could feel the tremor of her own body, every inch of her shaking as the darkness seemed to claw at her, pulling her back. Her heart pounded as she pushed herself forward, determined to reach the source of the voice. The light continued to grow, guiding her through the haze. But the further she moved toward it, the more she began to notice something chilling. The walls were no longer just breathing. They were alive. The faces of her ancestors, their eyes twisted and full of torment, seemed to shift within the walls themselves. The portraits, those portraits, were now part of the house itself. The curse had expanded. It wasn't just in the painting anymore. It had consumed the entire house. A cold shiver ran down Emma's spine as she realized the truth. This was no longer just a haunted house. The house was the curse. It had been alive all along, waiting for its next victim. Emma reached out, her hands trembling as they touched the walls. As soon as her fingers brushed the cold surface, the eyes of her ancestors blinked, and the walls seemed to ripple like a pool disturbed by a stone. She recoiled in horror. "What is happening?" she whispered in terror. But the walls responded. A loud, guttural growl vibrated from within the house itself, as though the house had been waiting to speak, waiting to claim her. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shift and writhe, taking on shapes, figures from the past, from the family portraits, emerging from the walls like dark specters. They surrounded her, their eyes glowing with malevolent energy. The air grew heavier with each passing moment, the very essence of the house pulsing with a dark rhythm. And then, she heard it. The unmistakable voice of the figure that had once spoken to her in the shadows. It was no longer a mere whisper. Now it boomed in her ears, echoing through the house, reverberating in her bones. "You belong to us," the voice hissed. "The portrait has consumed your soul. You are one of us now, forever." Emma tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. She felt her body growing colder, her limbs growing heavier, as if the weight of her ancestors' fate was being placed upon her shoulders. She wanted to fight, to escape, but the walls seemed to close in tighter with every passing second, as if they were alive and feeding on her fear. And then, just as all hope seemed lost, she heard it. Mark's voice, louder this time, cutting through the suffocating darkness. "Emma, run," he shouted. "Get out of there." She turned toward the sound, and in the distance, she saw him. Mark was standing in the middle of the hall, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. But he was still there, still alive. "Mark!" Emma cried, her voice finally breaking through the silence. She reached toward him, but as she moved, the walls seemed to shift, distorting the space between them. "No!" Mark shouted. "Don't come any closer." Before Emma could react, the walls around her began to twist violently, the faces of her ancestors now contorting in pain as they pressed against the walls, their mouths open in silent screams. The air grew thick with the suffocating energy of the curse. "It's too late." Mark's voice broke through once more, and Emma could see the horror on his face. "The portrait is alive. It's been waiting for you to complete the cycle." Suddenly, the house groaned, the walls shaking violently as though it was about to collapse on itself. The ground trembled beneath Emma's feet as the very foundation of the house began to crack, fissures running through the floor. In that moment, she realized the horrifying truth. The curse was no longer confined to the portrait. It had consumed the entire house, and now it was claiming them both. The walls began to close in on Emma as she ran toward Mark, but the house seemed to have a mind of its own. Doors slammed shut, trapping her in a labyrinth of shadows and horrors. She tried to claw her way out, but the air was thick, and her legs felt like they were wading through water. "No!" Emma screamed, her breath shallow. She could feel the weight of the curse closing in on her, her heart racing as she tried to break free. But the house, the curse, had other plans. And then, just as she thought she couldn't run anymore, the walls around her shattered in an explosion of dust and dark energy, sending her sprawling across the floor. Mark's voice reached her again, clearer now, as though the house was finally letting her hear him. "Emma, look out!" But it was too late. From the ruins of the broken walls, a figure stepped forward. It was a grotesque version of her ancestor, the twisted, monstrous form of the family that had created the curse. Emma screamed as the figure reached out, its fingers curling around her, pulling her toward the blackness once more. The pain in Sarah's chest was unbearable. She could feel the darkness pushing through her veins, crawling beneath her skin like ice-cold tendrils. Her breath was shallow, each exhale ragged and strained as if the very life was being drawn from her. The darkness that had threatened to escape the portal now seemed to be consuming her from within. It was as if the curse of the underworld had marked her, a punishment for her defiance. She staggered back from the now shrunken portal, clutching her chest in a desperate attempt to ease the burning pain. The world around her began to blur, the edges of her vision darkening. She felt dizzy, as if the ground beneath her were shifting, threatening to swallow her whole. But despite the agony coursing through her body, she couldn't afford to collapse. Not now. Not when she had just narrowly escaped one nightmare only to find herself facing another. As the portal continued to collapse in on itself, Sarah's mind raced. The creature's voice echoed in her ears, its chilling whispers lingering like a shadow in the back of her mind. "You cannot escape, Sarah. The price has been set. You are ours now." Her head spun. She had closed the portal, hadn't she? She had turned the key, stopped the dark forces from fully emerging. But it seemed that wasn't enough. The creature's words were now imprinted in her mind, and the curse was already starting to take hold. Sarah took one unsteady step back, her legs trembling beneath her. She glanced around, searching for something, anything, that could explain what was happening to her. But there was nothing. No answers, no escape. "What do you want from me?" she whispered, her voice barely a rasp. The answer came, not in words, but in a pulse of cold energy that seemed to emanate from deep within her. Her body trembled, and she felt the overwhelming urge to collapse, but she fought it. She had to stay conscious. She had to find a way out. As she struggled to stay on her feet, she realized that the world around her was changing. The once familiar forest now seemed wrong. The trees twisted unnaturally, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal hands, their leaves blackened and withered. The sky above had turned a sickly shade of red, casting an eerie glow over everything. The ground beneath her feet was no longer solid. It was shifting, as if the earth itself were alive, twisting and writhing beneath her. This wasn't the world she had known. This wasn't even her world. She had crossed over. The portal hadn't just opened a passage for the creature to emerge. It had torn open the very fabric of reality itself, pulling Sarah into the underworld. And now she was trapped. A low growl rumbled in the distance, sending a chill down Sarah's spine. She turned slowly, her heart pounding, and saw a pair of glowing eyes in the shadows. They watched her, unblinking, as the growl grew louder. Something was coming. Panic surged through her, and Sarah's legs gave way beneath her. She fell to the ground, her hands scraping against the rough earth. The pain in her chest was growing worse, now accompanied by an unnatural, burning sensation in her limbs. It felt as though something was crawling beneath her skin, twisting and burrowing its way deeper into her body. "No," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "I won't let this happen. I won't become like them." She forced herself to her feet again, ignoring the pain. Her body was fighting her, but she refused to give in. She had to find a way back to the world she knew. There had to be a way to reverse whatever had been done. The growling grew louder, and the ground trembled beneath her feet. The creatures were closing in. Sarah's eyes darted around, searching for any sign of an escape. But there was nothing, only the twisted, nightmarish landscape that stretched endlessly before her. "There is no escape, Sarah," the voice whispered again, this time in her mind. It was louder now, clearer. "You cannot outrun your fate. You belong to us, forever." She gritted her teeth, willing herself to focus. She couldn't let the creature win. She had to keep moving, keep fighting. The growl erupted into a roar, and Sarah spun around just in time to see a shadowy figure charge toward her, its glowing eyes burning with hunger. She barely had time to react before the creature lunged at her, its claws slashing through the air. Sarah dodged to the side, her breath catching in her throat. She had no weapon, no way to defend herself against the creature. Her only hope was to outrun it. But as she turned to flee, the ground beneath her feet cracked open, and she was sucked into the earth. The darkness swallowed her whole. The darkness enveloped Sarah like a suffocating blanket. She had barely any time to scream before the earth swallowed her whole, dragging her into a pit of endless black. Her limbs flailed as she fell, and the sensation of weightlessness made her stomach churn. The air felt thick, dense, and suffocating, as though the very atmosphere was pressing against her body. For what felt like an eternity, Sarah plummeted through the black void, the silence broken only by the thudding of her heartbeat in her ears. She couldn't see, couldn't make sense of what was happening. Her mind raced, her thoughts jumbled as she tried to make sense of the impossible nightmare she was in. Every part of her screamed to wake up, but she knew that this wasn't a dream. It was far too real. The cold was the first thing she noticed. It was so cold, it felt like the air itself had frozen her from the inside out. Her breath came out in short, sharp gasps, but the chill persisted, gnawing at her bones. She tried to move, but her body felt paralyzed, weighed down by an invisible force. Then, just as suddenly as the fall had begun, it stopped. Sarah crashed onto a hard, jagged surface, her body slamming against the cold ground. Pain shot through her limbs, but she barely had time to react before she realized something was wrong. She couldn't see a thing. The darkness had swallowed her whole, leaving her completely blind. Her heart raced, her breathing becoming shallow as panic set in. She tried to stand, to crawl, to move in any direction, but the sense of being completely lost in the dark was overwhelming. Her hands brushed against rough, uneven stone, and she could feel the air around her grow even colder. Her skin prickled with an unnatural chill, and she was suddenly aware that this place, whatever it was not just devoid of light. It was void of warmth, of life. "Where am I?" she whispered into the darkness, but her voice was swallowed by the emptiness, the silence so profound it felt suffocating. She had no idea where the portal had taken her, or how far she had fallen. But she knew one thing for sure. She was no longer in the world she knew. A low, distant growl echoed through the darkness. It sent a wave of icy terror through Sarah's chest, and she froze, her senses heightened. Her eyes strained in the blackness, desperate for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. Just the oppressive silence and the cold that seemed to seep into her very soul. The growl came again, louder this time, much closer. The air shifted, the temperature dropping even further, and the ground beneath her began to tremble. Her pulse quickened, panic rising within her chest as she realized that she wasn't alone. Whatever was in the dark with her, it was coming closer. Her breath hitched in her throat, and she stumbled backward, trying to push herself away from the sound. But there was nowhere to go. The ground was unforgiving, and the darkness was impenetrable. She could hear something moving, scraping, dragging, as though something was crawling just beneath the surface of the earth. "Please," Sarah muttered under her breath, her heart pounding against her ribcage. "Let me go back. Let me out." But there was no answer, only the sound of something closing in on her. Suddenly, a sharp, high-pitched shriek pierced the silence, cutting through the dark like a blade. It was a horrible sound, like a tortured scream, and it sent chills up her spine. Sarah's body went rigid with fear. Her mind screamed at her to move, to run, but her legs wouldn't obey. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the oppressive blackness that seemed to swirl and shift around her. Then, from the corner of her eye, a faint glimmer of light appeared. It was so faint, so small that Sarah wasn't sure if she had imagined it, but she saw it. A soft, flickering glow just beyond the reach of her vision. It was like a candle's flame, barely visible, but enough to offer a shred of hope in the overwhelming darkness. Without thinking, Sarah scrambled toward it, her body moving on instinct. She had to reach the light. It had to be a way out. The growls behind her grew louder, more insistent, and the shrieking sound intensified, becoming a cacophony of torment. As she reached the source of the light, she found herself standing before a towering, twisted gate. The glow was coming from a series of intricate runes etched into the stone archway. The symbols pulsed with an eerie energy, casting an unsettling light on the surrounding darkness. A voice, low and distorted, echoed from the depths of the gate, a sound that seemed to come from all around her. "Do you seek to escape, Sarah?" The voice sent a shiver down her spine, and she instinctively took a step back. She tried to speak, but her words caught in her throat. What was this place? Who was speaking to her? "Escape is not for the weak," the voice continued, each word laced with a sinister tone. "Those who cross the threshold must pay the price." A horrible realization dawned on Sarah. This wasn't just a gate. It was a barrier, a test. A door that led deeper into the underworld, one that required a sacrifice to pass through. The runes pulsed more intensely now, their light casting grotesque shadows that danced across the ground. She hesitated, her mind torn between fear and desperation. Was there any way out of this place? Or was she doomed to remain here forever, caught between the world of the living and the horrors of the underworld? The growl behind her reached a deafening crescendo, and she spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. No creatures were closing in. The voice spoke again, its tone mocking. "Time is running out, Sarah. Make your choice.